Ancient times were obviously very different from now. Kings would often have harems of women, people could be put to death for being gay, and even animals were treated differently. So how was life in ancient times? Well, here are 20 interesting facts about daily life in ancient times. Ancient Egypt is one of the most famous ancient civilizations around. The pyramids are still standing, and this means that some things have survived from thousands of years ago. Many other things have been found, such as tombs filled with treasure. While we know quite a lot about Egypt, it's still amazing what we don't know. We think that writing started around 3200 BC, and at first these writings were pictures, but eventually hieroglyphs were developed. At this time, there was also an alphabet with 24 letters. And this came before the alphabet used today by almost 3,000 years. Many people think that ancient Egypt was like a utopia. It must have been so advanced to build the pyramids. However, this wasn't true for everyone. While there were huge pyramids and temples, many Egyptians lived in small huts made of mud brick. Also, unlike what happens in movies, there were no slaves working on the pyramids. All Egyptians were free men. The only slaves were prisoners of war and criminals. Of course, this doesn't mean that life was great. Egyptians had to pay taxes in the form of labor. So instead of money, they paid the pharaoh by working on projects like the pyramids. This meant that the pharaoh could claim all the land and wealth for himself. If you were born in ancient Egypt, your life expectancy would probably be 35 years old. This was due to many things, but mostly warfare and disease were responsible. There were many wars between Egypt and other civilizations, and this resulted in many deaths. If you weren't killed in battle, you could die from something simple like a cold. Since medicine was not advanced, most diseases would end up being fatal. Did you know that people in ancient Egypt loved cats? Well, cats were worshipped as gods. They believed that cats were magical creatures who could protect them. In fact, killing a cat was punishable by death. Cats were so important that when one died, they would shave the head of the family in mourning. Egyptians kept cats as pets, but they also bred them for their own sport. Egyptians bred cats to fight rats and mice, and they would bet on which cat was the best. Ancient Greece is another civilization that's talked about a lot. They invented democracy and created beautiful sculptures. However, life for Greeks wasn't always easy. Most of the population were farmers and fishermen. They grew olives and grapes, and this provided food and drink. The Acropolis is one of the most famous places in Greece. It was a citadel located high up on a hill. During the Persian War, this is where people took refuge. Today, it's an archaeological site full of ancient ruins, but back then it was the heart of Athens. Life in ancient Greece was tough if you were a woman. Women couldn't vote and had very few rights. Their main job was to take care of the home while the man worked and made decisions. Women were expected to be submissive to their husbands and fathers, but Spartan women were a bit different. Spartan women could own property and were allowed to get a divorce. They were also expected to exercise and be strong. This was because Sparta was a military state. Boys would live separately from their families, and girls were trained to take over the household if their husband went off to war. If you've heard about ancient Rome, you know that it was a huge empire. Romans ruled over large areas of Europe, Africa, and Asia. They built roads, aqueducts, and public buildings. This made life a lot easier for the people living in Rome. If you were an ordinary Roman, you would probably live in a small apartment. These apartments would have been crowded and dirty, but the buildings were a lot safer than living in a house. Houses were prone to catching fire and destroying an entire neighborhood. In ancient Rome, there were no hospitals or ambulances. So if you were injured, you would have to wait for help at home. Doctors were also very expensive, so most people would treat themselves. Back then, the leading cause of death was bacterial infection. This was because doctors didn't wash their hands before treating patients. You could easily die from a simple cut if it got infected. Also, if you fell ill, there wasn't much that could be done. Most of the time, you would just have to wait it out. But in reality, this often meant that you would die. Did you know that ancient Mesopotamia was one of the cradles of civilization? This region is located in modern-day Iraq, Kuwait, and Turkey. It was here that humans began settling down and forming communities. This was around 6500 BC, and these settlements eventually grew into cities. In Mesopotamia, there were many famous civilizations like the Sumerians and the Babylonians. One of the most important inventions from this time was the wheel. The wheel was invented around 3500 BC, and it completely changed the way people lived. It made transportation much easier, and trade became more efficient. If you lived in ancient Mesopotamia, your life would have been really hard. Slavery was widespread, and it was common for people to be bought and sold. Also, there was a lot of poverty, and most of the population lived in small huts. Many people in ancient Mesopotamia were farmers. They grew crops like barley and wheat and raised animals like sheep and goats. Life was difficult because the weather was unpredictable, and sometimes there would be floods. But without these floods, there would have been no life at all. Floods would make the land extremely fertile, and this is why the Fertile Crescent is the cradle of civilization. In ancient Mesopotamia, there was a belief in an afterlife. They believed that when you died, you would go to a place called the underworld. The underworld was a scary place where the dead had to face many challenges. To help the dead person on their journey, the living would bury them with items they would need. This is how many treasures have been found from ancient Mesopotamia. If you were born in ancient China, you would have an arranged marriage. Your parents would arrange the marriage for you, and you wouldn't be able to choose who you marry. Girls would be married off at a young age, and most of the time they would be married to strangers. Arranged marriages are still happening today in some parts of the world, but back then, it was a necessity. If you weren't married, you would be looked down upon by society, and there would be pressure to find a spouse. One of the most famous rulers in ancient China was Qin Shi Huang. He was the first emperor of China, and he ruled from 221 to 206 BC. When he became emperor, there were many different states in China, but he wanted to unite them under one rule. So he set out to destroy all other states and force them to submit to him. Eventually, he was successful, and he became known as the Father of China. Did you know that the Great Wall of China was built to keep out invaders? It's one of the most famous landmarks in the world today, but it was built a long time ago. Construction started in 700 BC, and it was completed in the 17th century. The wall was built to protect Chinese people from the Mongols. But it wasn't a straight wall. It had watchtowers and battlements. It was also hundreds of miles long. So it's understandable that construction took so long. The Indus Valley civilization is one of the oldest in India. This civilization thrived between 2800 and 1800 BC. They lived in the northwest region of India and Pakistan. They built great cities and impressive public works. But sadly, we don't know much about them today. Archaeologists have found many artifacts, but they haven't been able to decipher their language. This has made it hard to learn about their culture and way of life. If you were a woman in ancient India, you would have been able to do many things. Unlike other civilizations, women in ancient India were given many rights. They could own property and even become rulers. They could also participate in religious ceremonies and festivals. There are many stories about powerful women in Hindu mythology, so it's clear that women were respected in ancient India. Ancient Thebes was a city-state in Greece. They were famous for their military strength. Every 4 years, an elite military force would be chosen to defend the city. They became famous for defeating the Persians at the Battle of 722 BC. This battle is considered one of the most important in history. Thebes was able to defeat Persia thanks to their king, Epaminondas. He was a brilliant military strategist and is considered one of the greatest generals of all time. Prehistoric humans were hunter-gatherers. This means that they got their food by hunting animals and gathering plants. They lived in caves or made small shelters out of rocks and leaves. Their lives were very difficult, and they had to constantly move from place to place. There were many dangers, such as wild animals and rival tribes. But despite these dangers, they were able to survive for many years. They developed tools made of stone and wood, and they also learned to use fire. They also developed language, which helped them to communicate and work together. We don't know much about prehistoric humans, but we do know a little. We know that they had a culture, and they believed in spirits and magic. They buried their dead and made cave paintings. Some of these paintings show animals, while others show humans with animal characteristics. This suggests that they believed that humans could transform into animals. They may have also believed that animals could speak and interact with humans. Ancient Crete was an advanced civilization. They built impressive palaces and developed a complex legal system. They also had a unique writing system, but it's sad that we can't read it. Linear A is the name of their writing system, and it was used from 1800 to 1450 BC. We haven't been able to decipher it yet, so we don't know much about the Minoan civilization. Minoan civilization lasted for 600 years, but eventually it collapsed. There was a volcanic eruption on the island of Thera, and this caused the economy to collapse. Eventually, the Mycenaean civilization invaded Crete and destroyed their culture. Which fact surprised you the most? Let me know in the comments below. Be sure to give this video a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.